In the overview video, I talked about how UiPath is a holistic solution containing the UiPath Studio plus the UiPath Orchestrator and robots. So far in the course, we've covered UiPath Studio, which is the IDE for developers. We talked about installation, orientation, some basic skills, variables, and error handling. Now that we've covered some of those basics of creating software robots, I think it's very important to take a quick break and discuss UiPath Orchestrator, which you're going to use for centralized bot management, triggering, and logging, plus the robots themselves, whether attended or unattended. The true power of RPA is most realized when you scale out and have multiple unattended robots and multiple attended robots all doing work at the same time. In order to accomplish this, it's important to use some kind of centralization mechanism that acts as a control room and also centralizes and aggregates log results. That's one of the big reasons I like the UiPath solution so much, is because they do provide a holistic solution that has unattended robots, attended robots, and a centralized orchestration server. I am going to create an entire separate course about comprehensive orchestrator use, but in this section, I wanted to give you a quick peek at the fundamentals of Orchestrator so you get a sense of its power. We'll start off with a quick high-level overview of Orchestrator. Then we'll create an account on UiPath's demo platform. Then we'll log in, configure some settings, and tour the interface. Then we'll register a robot. We'll create an environment and associate a robot to that environment. Then we'll publish a package from the robot to the Orchestrator. We'll schedule a job and examine the logs after it runs. And then we'll take a look at how to manually run a job as well. Orchestrator is a web application that has a database on the back end. It offers environments like dev, test, and production. It allows you to register multiple robots. You can store multiple assets in a centralized repository that all robots can have access to. You can upload versioned packages. And finally, you can schedule robot runs and centralize your logs. You can register as many unattended robots and attended robots as you'll need to get your work done. You could conceivably set up one instance of Orchestrator and configure multiple environments within it, like dev, test, and production. But the more realistic scenario is that you'll have multiple instances of Orchestrator installed, and you'll have some kind of a gated deployment process that moves any given robot from dev to test to stage and finally into production. And of course, in dev and test, you'll have a smaller number of test robot machines connected, but in your prod instance, you'll have a full load of unattended and attended robots. For true enterprise scenarios, you'll be installing Orchestrator on-prem on your own servers. For this section, I'm going to make use of UiPath's demo instance of Orchestrator at platform.uipath.com, and there they allow you to connect 2 free dev robots. So let's dive in and take a look. In my full UiPath Orchestrator course, I would teach you how to install the Orchestrator web application to a local server, but in this lecture, we're simply going to create an account on UiPath's demo platform in the cloud. I've navigated to demo.uipath.com, and since I don't yet have an account, I can click on this Become a Tenant button down at the bottom. Orchestrator allows you to create multiple tenants on any given instance of Orchestrator. This allows a single server to service several different separate named instances so that you can separate users and processes and robots and not get overwhelmed if you have a large company with lots of locations, divisions, or departments. So for the tenancy, you might use things like finance, marketing, human resources, and so on. For this demo, I'll just use what is RPA. The username in this cloud app is read-only, so you can't change it. I'll add my first and last name here, email address, and my desired password. I will agree to the terms and services and click on Create the Tenant. And it's as quick and simple as that. We now have a fully functional account in UiPath's demo Orchestrator platform. In this video, I'll briefly show you how to log into Orchestrator, configure a couple of settings, and we'll take a quick tour of the interface. I'm already logged in from having created an account, so to log out, I would simply go to this user menu here, click on it, and select Log Out. If you had installed Orchestrator on-prem in a local server, down here at the bottom of the login form, you'd have the ability to click on Login with Windows, and that would simply SSO you in using your Windows login ID. In this case, since we're using the UiPath cloud platform, I'll simply type in my tenancy name, username, or email. In this case, I'll use my email. Type in the password we provided when we signed up, and click Login. Now that we're inside, one of the first things you're going to want to do is again hover over this user menu in the top right, click on it, and select Settings. Notice this is where you'd also go to create and modify users and to go see an audit history of things that have been changed in the system. For now, I'll go into Settings, and you can see there are multiple tabs at the top of the page. General is where we would specify our desired time zone. If you work in a company that has many geographically disparate locations, you'll probably want to click on this and scroll down the list as these negatives get smaller until you find UTC Coordinated Universal Time. That way, you can schedule your robots using a location-agnostic time zone. If you were a small company or just demoing it for yourself, you could select your own local time zone instead. I'm in California, so I will select Pacific Time, US and Canada. I'll click on Save. On the License tab is where you would see the number of licenses you've paid for. When you buy licenses from UiPath, you can purchase attended licenses, which are robots that human agents will use to help get their jobs done, and those are less expensive than unattended licenses. Unattended licenses are for computers that will simply process jobs all day long. Notice we get 2 free development licenses because I haven't paid for anything. So just signing up for an account here on their demo platform gives us those 2 free licenses. On the Deployment tab, this tells us the URL where our packages will be published. We won't have to do anything with this information for now. If you wanted the Orchestrator system to be able to send email, you would configure it in here. I'm not going to do that. And the Security tab allows you to set up various security settings for your Orchestrator users. Taking a quick tour of the UI, on the left here, we've got the robots page. This is where we'll come in and click this plus button to register new robots. You'll see we also have an environments tab up here, and this allows us to create environments like dev, test, stage, prod, and then group our robots according to the desired environment. The Processes tab is where we will click this plus button to create processes. Those are work that has been automated. Creating a process gives that work a name. Behind the scenes for any process is what's called a package, and these are the UiPath robots we build. As you'll see in a future lecture, the first thing we do is we upload a package from our UiPath IDE, and then we go to the Processes tab, create a new process, and select one of those uploaded packages. The Jobs tab is going to show all robots that are currently executing or have executed in the past. And as you'll see in a future video, we can manually run one of our processes on a given robot by clicking this play button. The Schedules tab allows us to use this plus sign to create new scheduled instances of our processes. And of course, we'll select one or more robots to go with that process as well. I'll show you that in a future video. The Assets page is where we can use this plus sign to essentially create variables here on the Orchestrator server. They can be of type text, Boolean, integer, or credentials. And credentials are great because you can securely store login credentials for different websites or systems here, and one or more robots can access those credentials and interact with the systems without anybody else seeing those credentials. So we create an asset, and then we can use an activity in the robot to get those asset values by name. Queues are a little more advanced, so I'm not going to spend any time on that in this section. But if you're familiar with queues from a programmatic sense, then you know what I'm talking about. It's basically a very fast, durable container into which your robot can toss messages that need to be processed and some action taken. So that's it. You can see that the Orchestrator UI is fairly intuitive and offers lots of features. In this video, we will connect our local computer, which is a robot, to the Orchestrator server so that we can then schedule our process to execute on our remote robot machine. As you recall, UiPath Orchestrator can drive unattended robots, or it can serve assets to and aggregate the logs of attended robots. So to connect my computer to Orchestrator, I've navigated to platform.uipath.com and signed in. And this is the same system that can be accessed by demo.uipath.com you might see in other videos. The most current version of UiPath has split the process of connecting a robot into 2 steps. First, we connect a machine, and then we create a robot for that machine. So first I'll click on the Machines tab and click on this plus button, and notice we get these 3 pop-up icons. We're almost always going to click on this standard machine icon, but UiPath does offer this machine template, which will allow us to create what they call floating robots in case your robot users are using VDIs whose computer names change every day, or who use different computers on any given day they're working. This will simply cancel out of the new machine creation mode. So I'll click on Standard Machine, and it's asking me to put in the name of the machine. To find the name of the machine, I usually go into Windows Explorer and then find this PC icon, right-click on that and select Properties. On this main Properties window, you see computer name is right there, Brian-Laptop. So that's what I'll use for my computer name. You would also be able to see your network domain name in here, I believe, if you need that. I'm not on a network, so I don't need that value. Since this is case insensitive, I can type in Brian-Laptop and click Provision. So now we see that my computer has a record on the Machines tab. If you hover over that row, you can click this I to get the machine key that we'll need for part 2 of this process. So I'm going to select that and use Control-C to copy it, and close this up. We can also hover on these 3 dots to view logs for this machine, view installed versions of UiPath, to view which robots are associated with this machine over on this other Robots tab, or of course to delete this machine. In order to delete the machine, however, you have to make sure you delete all the robots first. So let's move to part 2, which is on the Robots tab. I'll click the plus icon to create a new robot, and again we have these icons that pop up. In this course, I'm only going to be talking about standard robots, but if you are in an enterprise and you use different computers on a daily basis, you might need to create these floating robots. So I'll just click on Standard Robot, and fortunately I don't need to remember my machine name. I can simply click on this machine dropdown and select the desired machine for which I'd like to create a robot. Now we can provide a plain text name for the robot. I'll just call this Brian's Robot. And then you need to provide the Windows login name that Orchestrator can use to log into the machine when it needs to perform work. This is primarily used for unattended robots, because attended robots already have a user session that's logged in. So I'm typing my Windows user account here. And again, if you were on a network, you would type in the domain name with a backslash there. But I'm not on a network, so I'll delete that. And one important thing to note here is that Microsoft has recently introduced the ability to use a Microsoft Live account to log into your computer. And if you're using that feature of Windows, this won't work. You have to use a normal Windows login account when you create robots like this. Since I won't be running attended, I don't necessarily need to put my password in here, but I'll enter it anyway. Now we move down and we select what type of license this is going to be. I haven't yet paid for attended or unattended licenses, and I have not been granted any non-production licenses. Platform.uipath.com comes with 2 free development licenses, so I will select that. Description is free text and can be whatever you want. I'll just type in my first robot. But of course, you could use this field to explain some metadata about this robot and how it will be used. The Settings tab, you can pretty much leave as defaults. This gives you the ability to override some of the connection features that can also be set on the robot machine itself. But this is more advanced stuff and we don't need to get into it. Back here on Description, there is a checkbox to create another. And if you do check that, it will allow you to rapidly add multiple robots one after the other. I'm only creating one, so I'll just click on the Create button here. And now we see this new row is there, but it's got this black X and it says it's disconnected. Once we do the final step, the Orchestrator server will ping the robot machine and it will turn this black X into a green light, and it will give us a sense that this robot machine is connected and healthy. The final step of connecting the robot happens on the robot machine itself. When you install UiPath on any given robot machine, it will install a Windows service called UiPath Robot. And we access that down here in the task tray near the clock, and it's this little icon right down here. If you do not see this UI icon in your task tray, make sure you go to your Start menu, type in UiPath Robot, and click on that to run it. That will bring your task tray icon up, and when you click on it, it gives you this little pop-up window, and notice it says the robot is offline. Once you're online, it will show you the various attended robots that have been assigned to this particular machine. To do the connection, we'll use this little gearbox icon. Click on that and select Settings. Notice it already knows the computer name, and in this third text box is where we paste in that machine key that we copied from Orchestrator. Now we simply need to grab the Orchestrator URL, which in this case is platform.uipath.com, and paste that in there. If you work at a company, you'll probably have your own internally hosted version of Orchestrator, and you would use that URL instead. I have the ability down here at the bottom to specify what level of logging I would like this robot to send to Orchestrator. In cases where you're having problems, you might request that your users set this to trace, but just bear in mind that that sends more verbose logging information to the server, so it will fill up your logging database more quickly. Of course, the presence of trace logging items is dependent upon the RPA developer. If they haven't added any trace log items, then the robot won't send any trace items to the server. Generally speaking, I leave this set to Information, and I click on Connect. Now when I bring Orchestrator back and go to the Robots page, we see that we've got this green check mark and the status says Available. So we have now connected our robot machine to the UiPath server. You can see that this robot is not currently assigned to an environment, so we'll do that in the next video. If you need to edit information about this robot, you can hover over this pencil and click on it, and that brings up those values we just entered before. You can also hover and click on these three dots and view logs for this robot, or duplicate it, or remove it. UiPath Orchestrator, out of the box, has a feature that allows you to split up robots and processes by different environments like dev, test, stage, and production. Every robot must be associated with at least one environment in order to be able to run a process on that robot. Let's do that now. So I'm here at demo.uipath.com, I'm logged in, and I've created a robot, but as you can see, the environment column is blank for that robot. I'm on the robot's left nav tab, and I'm on the first tab here called Robots. In order to create a new environment, I need to click on this Environment tab here, and click on this plus sign button on the right-hand side. This is where I can name my environment anything I want, and I can identify it as a type, dev, test, or prod. I'll be redundant and I'll call it dev. In here I'll just type in a development environment and click on Create. And now it automatically opens up this Manage Dev Environment window for us. It's going to allow us to select one or more of our robots to add into this new environment. In this case, I'll click on Brian's robot and click Update. If you want to go back in and change that later, you can hover over this row, click on the pencil to edit the various names and types, or click on this grid right here to open up that Manage window again and add or remove robots. So that's how we can create environments and add or remove robots to those environments. UiPath Orchestrator makes it very easy to publish robots that you've created or updated from a local dev machine into the Orchestrator server. Let's look at publishing a package from a robot to Orchestrator now. To demo this, I've opened up UiPath Studio and I'm going to create a brand new robot. You can follow along with me and create the same robot, or just upload a robot you've already created. I'm going to select blank and name this my remote robot because we're going to upload it to a remote server. I'll copy and paste that down here and I'm saving it in C Development UiPath as usual. I'll double click this ribbon for now to give me some more real estate. As you know, we need to start with a sequence or a flowchart. I'll just grab a sequence and drag and drop that here. I'll rename this as Remote Robot Stuff. Now, of course, we could add activities to do whatever we want when this robot runs. I want something visible, so I'll type in message box and I'll drag a message box in and I'll create a string and I'll just type in hello from Orchestrator. So that way when the robot runs, it's going to pop up a dialog in our face and the robot will stay open until I click that message box to dismiss it. I'll also quickly demonstrate how we can interact with the file system. So I'll type in text here, drag this out a bit, and I'll grab write text file and drag that in. So we need a file name here and then some text to write. So for the file, open my quotes again. I'll use c:\orchestrator-output.txt, and in here I'll just copy this same text from my message box and paste that there. And now finally, so that we can see some results in the Orchestrator log from this robot, let's use log message and drop that in after we write a text file. And here I'll open my quotes and say the robot worked. So that's my robot. I'll hit Control S to save. Since this computer is connected to Orchestrator, UiPath makes it really easy to publish these robots. If you click on the Setup tab, all you need to do is click on Publish, and the robot automatically gets pushed up to this URL here, and our Orchestrator instance knows where that is. Of course, if this was an on-prem instance, this publish location would be pointing at your on-prem server. You can use Control-C to copy the information if you need to notify anybody, but all we really need to do is click on OK, and now we can close UiPath because this IDE doesn't need to be open to run the robot. There's a robot service running in the back end, and that's what Orchestrator will control. In the next video, we'll create a process and schedule it. Now that we've created a robot and published the package to Orchestrator, we need to create a process in Orchestrator from that package. Let's do that now. So we're going to click on Processes in the left nav, and we'll use this plus button here to create a new process. You can see that since we're on UiPath's demo platform, it's trying to load all the packages here. Now it's done loading, so I'll click in here and start typing the name of the package I created, my_remote. So you can see that when I published my remote robot with spaces, Orchestrator replaced those with underscores. You can see there's only one version of that package that's been uploaded. Every time I upload it from here out, it would add another version to this list. I'll leave the environment set to dev, and I'll just type in my first process here and click on create. So what we've done here is we've uploaded a package, and then we created a process that wraps around that package, and we've associated it with one of the environments that we've created on this robots page. So now, any robot that's associated with that environment will be able to run that process. In the next video, we'll schedule it and run it. Now that we have registered the robot, and created an environment, and published a package, and created a process for that package, we can now schedule a job and examine the logs. There are 3 different ways we can run a job from Orchestrator. One of those ways is actually to click on our UiPath task tray, and we'll see that robot sitting right here in the task tray with a play button. This is how we run attended robots. And you can see that our process, my remote robot, is associated with the dev environment. As new processes are uploaded to Orchestrator and assigned to the environment to which this robot is assigned, we would see those processes automatically appear in this task tray. So just to prove that the robot is working, I'm going to click on that play button. So you can see that the robot shows up down here and displays our message box. I'll click OK, and it looks like we're getting an error. So I'll OK that error, and let's go look on the C drive, and notice our text file wasn't created. So this gives us an opportunity to jump into Orchestrator and examine the log to see if we can figure out what went wrong. If the robot had been scheduled or run manually from the jobs page, that execution would show up here on the jobs page. But since we ran it as an attended robot from this task tray, what we need to do now is go to the robots page and hover over this robot, hover over this 3 dots, click on it, and then click View Logs. So now you can see the log items for that attended robot. We see the start and the end and any items in between. So here, I'll click on this I to view details. And it's telling us our write text file has failed. But it's not really giving us any information beyond that. Notice the other information we get with this log item include the timestamp, the Windows identity and machine name, the process name, process version, a job ID, and so on. So let's open up UiPath, fix the robot, publish a new version, and run it again. So we're here back inside UiPath, and I could very easily go into execute here and click on debug to figure out what the problem is. But I already know what the problem is because I intentionally did this, so we'd be forced to look at those Orchestrator logs. The problem is the robot doesn't have access to write to the C drive. We can see that if we copy our text file name and click on these 3 dots, navigate to the C drive, paste this in, and try to save. Windows is tightening up security, so they don't allow you to save directly in the C drive, I'll click on No, and I'll double click on this 01 robot output directory I've created inside the C drive. So now when I click on Save, UiPath replaces my original path with this new path. And we can click play to test the robot to ensure there's no more errors. There's our message box. I click OK. The robot finishes. And you can see inside my C01 robot output, my file has been created and it has the desired text. I'll delete that so we can watch Orchestrator do it next time. So now this is where you get to see the versioning I was talking about. I go back to Setup, click on Publish. I get my success dialog. Now I need to jump back into Orchestrator and go to the Processes page to update which package version that process is using. So I hover over my desired process, click on View Versions, and now you can see I have two versions, and it says this one is current and this one was published a minute ago. It's very important that after you publish a new package to Orchestrator that you go in here and you click on this Use button and confirm yes. Now my process is using a newer version of that package. If I need to roll back for some reason, I can simply click on View Versions again, hover over the older version, and click on Use for that version. It's as simple as that to publish new versions and upgrade. So now I've closed UiPath on my local computer. We can go ahead and run this again as an attended robot to watch it work this time. So I click here. Notice now, since I've published a new version of the package, the attended robot sees an update button. So this allows you to do seamless package updates in the background because the attended robot user can be running the old version while you're uploading a new version, and then the next time they go to use the robot, they'll see an update button. If I click on that update button, it becomes a play button again. So I'll click to start. Now we see our message box, and we see the icon down here in our bottom menu. When I click on OK, that icon goes away. That means the robot completed successfully. No errors. If I open up my C drive again, in this 01 robot output directory, we've got our file written at 11:41 p.m., which matches the current time. So I'll delete that again. Now let's schedule the process instead of running it as an attended robot. To do that, I go to the Schedules tab here on the left and use the plus icon to create a new scheduled item. I can name this whatever I want. This is where I select my desired process to schedule. I've only got one right now, so I'll select that. We can set the time zone that we want to use for scheduling. It defaults to the same time zone you've selected up here in your master settings. That's fine for now. If I scroll down, you can see that I can schedule this every n minutes, every n hours, every n days, every n weeks, months, or advanced. Advanced will allow you to use cron syntax to be very specific about when this thing is scheduled and run. For now, since it's 11:43, I'm simply going to schedule it hourly to run every 1 hour, which is the current hour, at minute 45. So that's 1 minute from now. When I click on Create, you can see we'll eventually have a list of scheduled processes, and Orchestrator is going to tell us when each one will run next, respectively. So when this runs, it'll show up on the Jobs page, and when it's done, this will say a few seconds ago. You can see that it's 11:45, and it says it ran a few seconds ago. And if we jump over to the Jobs tab here on the left, you can see this robot is currently running, and it's going to keep running as long as I leave this message box open. We can also confirm it's running by looking at the icon down here in our menu bar. And if I hover over this, I can click on More Actions and View Logs, and we can see the commands that have executed so far. So far, it's only started. When I click to OK this, and then refresh this log page, now you'll see the rest of the log items showed up, and of course these things can be filtered by their level, or when they happened, or here you can type in custom search text to filter out these items by specific terms. So of course if I copy this and paste in worked, now we only see that one log item. So that's how we schedule robots to run, and we examine their log files. One last way to run the robot is by using this play button right here, and that's very similar to running it using the task tray start button. If I click that start button, It allows me to select a process to run, and since this process is in the dev environment, it will list all the robots in that dev environment and allow me to choose one. So I'll click on this checkbox here, and I'll click on Start. You can see that a new job row shows up here, and it says that it's currently running. If I click on OK, the robot eventually finishes as successful, and of course we can view the log by clicking here and selecting View Logs. We can hover here and export this log if we want to. That prompts you to save the log as a CSV file. So hopefully you can see how intuitive and capable UiPath Orchestrator is. I'll talk about assets in a future video because they're very handy as well. But as you can see, creating robots, creating processes, and then running them as attended robots or scheduling them could not be easier. In a previous section, we talked about using variables in our scripts to hold information that was important to the script and could be reused in different parts of the script. One problem with creating variables and holding data in the script is that if that data needs to change at some point, you're going to need to modify the robot and redeploy it on one or more machines that use that robot. While UiPath and Orchestrator does make it easy to redeploy attended robots to multiple people's machines, it's still going to be preferable to find some way to create a centralized variable on a server that can be changed without redeploying robots. UiPath's Assets feature solves that exact problem. On the left side of Orchestrator, I'm going to click on the Assets tab, and notice I have the ability to use this plus sign to create a new asset. Our assets are simply variables, and they can be of type text, Boolean, integer, or credentials. And notice that we have the ability to create a single value for all robots, or we could click on this Value per Robot tab, create an asset name, select the desired type, and then select different robots down here and provide a unique value per robot. I'm sure you could think of many use cases for that, but I'm not going to talk about it too much other than to suggest that it's one way you could approach the dev, test, stage, and prod problem. Because if you had a URL and maybe credentials that are different for your dev website versus your test server versus your production server, you could handle that here. The alternative could be that you could provide different names or user credentials for any given attended robot, and the list goes on. I'm going to switch back to single value here to keep things simple. The fundamental concept behind assets is that I'll create a named variable here in the Orchestrator server of one of these types, and I'll provide a value for that variable. Then here in UiPath, I would go to the Activities pane, type in the word asset, and you can see under the Orchestrator assets, I have getAsset and getCredential. When you hover over it, you can see that getAsset will get a specified asset by using a provided asset name. Whereas with getCredential, this is specifically for the credential type and is going to return a username and a secure password. So the way you would use it is to drag it into a workflow, use your double quotes here, and provide the name of the asset that you created here in the asset name field. That will return the value that you stored under that name, and UiPath will store that in a new variable of your choosing. And if you set the scope correctly, you can then use that variable in as many different activities as you like. To demonstrate this, let's create an asset and a simple robot that uses that asset. Let's pretend that we work at Amazon and we want to create a robot that interacts with the Amazon website. We would go to the Assets page here by clicking on the Assets tab on the left, use the plus sign, type in the desired name of our variable. In this case, we'll call it site URL. I will leave it set to text, and under value here, I will not use quotes, and I'll type in the URL amazon.com and click Add. It's as simple as that to create a new asset in Orchestrator. One thing I'll warn you about, however, is that you might be creating multiple robots, and maybe different robots will need to interact with different websites. So bear in mind that the name site URL is fairly ambiguous. So of course, if you needed to create multiple robots that all need to interact with different websites, you would want to use some kind of a name spacing scheme to differentiate your assets. And what I mean by that is, instead of the generic site URL, I would provide the name of the robot And in this case, I'm going to call the robot my asset robot. So I would type in that robot's name and put a dot here. Now we'll be able to use Orchestrator to save assets having the same name for many different kinds of robots. If I had a different robot that needed a different URL, I might do something like myotherrobot.siteURL. I'll change this back and let's move along. I'll click Update to make my change. And now you can see that the asset has been updated with my namespaced name. And we can also see the value that that asset contains. Creating credentials is similar. You click the plus sign, and you might namespace it the same way, myassetrobot.siteURL.login credentials. You would set this as a credential and type in your username and password that goes along with that website. You can show the password if you need to. When I click on Add, now I've got a credentials asset, and the only thing it shows here is the username. If I click Edit, notice that the password is never displayed again. You can't even click this anymore to view it. The only thing you can do is type in a new password to change it. In the next video, we'll talk about how to consume assets from the UiPath robot. In the previous lecture, we used UiPath Orchestrator's Assets feature to essentially create a named, centralized variable that holds a value. Let's see how we can make use of this in a robot. So back here in UiPath, I'm going to click on Start and create a new blank project. As discussed in the previous video, I'm going to name this My Asset Robot, and I'll just copy and paste that down here in the description and click Create. I'll be talking more about how to automate web browsers in a future section, but since we've created an asset with a URL, I'll give you a quick preview of how it works here. As usual, when I start a robot, I would normally grab a try-catch block. For now, I'll just use a sequence or a flowchart. So I click and drag a sequence on, and I'll just name this the whole process. To interact with a web browser, I go back to my activities and type in the word browser. Notice we have several browser activities, but the one I'm looking for is Open Browser. I click and drag that into my whole process. You can see that this activity is expecting a URL, and as always, the text must be quoted. So I'll demo how to do this without using an asset first. Open my quotes, type in my URL, and over here in our Properties pane, you can see that the browser type that's going to open is IE. If I click on that, I could also select Firefox or Chrome. At the bottom, I have the ability to create a new variable to hold that browser object in case I want to do things with it like maximize or minimize or close later on. I won't do that right now. This is literally all it takes to open up a browser. But so that we can see the browser open without the robot stopping and coming back to UiPath Studio, I'm going to grab a delay, and you could either use the raw delay activity or jump into our library here at the top left, open up snippets, open delay, and grab one of these preset delays. So I'm going to click on the 3 seconds and drag it into this do block. And this is just a normal delay. It just comes preset with the amount of seconds it's going to wait. I can change that to 5 seconds if I want to. So my expectation now is when I click on this play button, UiPath Studio will disappear, the IE browser will open to the URL amazon.com. So let's click play and try it. There's our browser, and the robot waits for 5 seconds, and then stops and returns. Simple as that. I'll minimize UiPath and close that browser for the next run. So now I'm using the Control key and moving my mouse wheel to shrink things down a little bit so we can see everything. As I mentioned before, the problem with just typing the URL here in the robot is that if this URL changes, I would need to go to Setup and Publish to push a new version of the robot up to the server, allowing my attended users to download and use the new version. While that's easy enough, it's better to simply place this value on the UiPath server as an asset. That way, you can log into UiPath, click on this Edit button, and update that value anytime in real time without having to republish your robots and generate a new version. So we've already got this asset in Orchestrator. Let's take a look at how to consume it from the robot. Inside my whole process, what I might do is use additional activity blocks, whether they be sequences or flowcharts, to break up my flow into sections. I might have a setup section where I get my assets and store them as variables. And then I'll have another block that represents the work that I do. So let's do that. I'll grab 2 more sequences and drag them in here. I'll rename this one to setup and this one to do the work. So we already know that we've got this open browser activity, and that's part of my do the work. So I'm simply going to click and drag that inside do the work. Now we have to utilize this setup block to get the asset we need for our work. So over here in the activities pane, I type in assets and I click and drag get asset into my setup section. As you can see, when I click on get asset in the properties window, the 3 things I can provide are timeout in milliseconds, and I'll often use something like 3000, which is 3 seconds. Then when I hover over this, you can see that I need to provide the name of the asset to be retrieved, and it's a string. So as you recall, we named our asset myAssetRobot.siteURL. SiteURL was my intended asset name, but you may recall that I namespaced it to designate which robot uses that value. So I'm simply going to drag to select this entire thing, Control-C to copy it, go back to UiPath, click in here, open my quotes, which also adds a closing quote for me, and I'll use Control-V to paste in that value. Clicking on these 3 dots reveals that I've entered the full name of my asset. But you can see there's an extra space there, so out of diligence, let me delete that and click OK. Now that we've retrieved the asset from Orchestrator, we need to save it into a variable here in the robot so other activities can make use of it. So I'm going to right-click, select Create Variable, and I'll name it something like the site URL. And when I hit Return, my usual instinct is to jump down here to the variable section to examine what scope that wound up in. So you can see the site URL is a generic value, and I'm going to leave it that way, but you can see that the scope is set up. And as you may recall from the variables section, the contents of this variable can only be used within this activity. Our goal is to make use of it in this activity and beyond. So a sensible thing to do would be to click on the asset and change the scope of this variable by clicking on it and raising the scope higher to the whole process. So now my site URL variable has the scope of the whole process, which wraps up all of the activities within it. So that means once I get that value, I'll be able to use it within Do the Work and Open Browser respectively. To prove that, I'll click in here and delete this and start typing the name of my variable. And notice the autocomplete is showing me the name of the variable, so I can simply hit Tab. Now since this is a generic value, I'm going to add dot to string and hit Tab. So now my open browser is going to do the same thing. It's going to open a browser to Amazon.com and then wait 3 seconds. The difference is, instead of us supplying the URL directly, we have this setup section which is using the get asset activity to get this named asset and store its value in this variable, which is subsequently used in the open browser activity. So of course now when I click on the play button, I would expect the browser to open to Amazon.com, wait 5 seconds, and then the robot will return. So now this shows us the beauty of centralizing that value, because instead of changing and republishing the robot, I can simply jump in here and change my value whenever I need to. In this case, we'll change it to google.com and click Update. Now you can see that site URL asset has a value of google.com, and I'll close my original browser window here and click Play to rerun the robot. And this time, the browser opens to google.com instead of Amazon, waits 5 seconds, and returns control. Obviously, if we needed to log into this website, within our setup section here, we would drag get credentials in there. We would grab the name of this credentials asset, copy it, and paste it in, deleting that extra space. And now you can see that we need to create 2 different variables. I would click in here and right-click to create my password variable, and then right-click once more to create my username variable. And again, my instinct would immediately be to jump down here to variables and set the scope to something more appropriate, like the whole process. The key difference when using credentials is that you would use one of these type activities, and for username you would use type into. For password, you would use type secure text. So once the browser is open, we would do some stuff, such as type into, and we would use this to indicate which element we wanted to type into. And what are we going to type? We can type in THE and select the username dot toString. Then for the password, we would drag this one in. Again, use this link to select the desired locator, and I'll cover that in a future section. And instead of having a text box like this, for type secure text, we've got to go up here and again click in the secure text box, start typing THE, double click on the password. And when I hover over this, notice it says this field only supports secure string variables. And the fact that we got this from the Orchestrator credentials activity already makes this variable a secure string. So we don't need to type .toString here. When I click away, notice there are no validation warnings. So hopefully that gives you a great understanding of how to use Orchestrator assets and gives you lots of ideas for how to apply them. One obvious application, if you're an enterprise that has a dev instance of Orchestrator and a test instance of Orchestrator and a production instance of Orchestrator, you could type in the same asset in each one of them, but of course, different values in each one of them. So in your test instance, the site URL asset would say dev.mysite.com. But on the test instance, an asset with the same name would say test.mysite.com, and so on. So that way, the same robot code could be deployed on a machine that points at a dev instance of Orchestrator, and it would get the right URL. And without making any changes, you could move it to a machine that's connected to your test instance of Orchestrator, and by using that same asset name, it would get the test.mysite.com URL. Hopefully that makes sense. Assets are a very powerful feature in UiPath Orchestrator. I highly recommend them for enterprise use. Just be sure to remember my namespacing tip so you don't wind up with a bunch of ambiguous assets and end up with a bunch of confused robots. In the previous video, we talked about assets, and specifically, I called out a scenario where certain assets were used only by a certain robot. And by putting them into Orchestrator, it allows us to easily change the values of those assets from the Orchestrator UI instead of having to modify and republish the robot. The more recent versions of the UiPath platform have introduced a concept where we can now supply arguments at the robot level instead of just down at the workflow level. I talk about parameters for workflows in a section that's coming up. Since we just discussed assets that pertain to a particular robot, I'd like to show you how these robot-level input arguments work because they are able to take their values from changes we make in Orchestrator. To demonstrate this, I created a blank project called Input Parameters. I've added a sequence and a message box. And this is very similar to what we did in the previous example. The only difference is, in the previous example, I used a literal string so that when the robot would run, it would pop up a message box that had a literal string in it. Of course, the only way for me to change this message is to modify the robot and then publish it back to Orchestrator again. This concept of input arguments allows us to use this Arguments tab just below the canvas, and much like we discussed in the Variables section, I can jump in here and create a new argument whose direction can be in or out, in, out, or property. And I'll talk about these more in a future video, but for now I'm going to leave this as an input variable so that we can provide different inputs to the robot via Orchestrator. UiPath recommends that you only use simple types for this, like string or int or boolean. So I'll leave this as string, and notice I've called it what to say using camel case. So I'll close up this arguments window, and in my message box, instead of displaying a literal string, I'll paste in that argument that I just created. And actually, it's important to know that much like variables, I can provide a default value for this. So in here, I'll create a string and type in robot's default value. And of course, this could be anything, but you'll see in a minute why I typed that. So I'll close up arguments and run the robot. So now you see, when I run locally, that input parameter uses the default value and provides this message. So I'm going to click on Design and publish this to my Orchestrator instance. Click on Publish. And of course, you'll have to go through the motions of creating a new process and associating that package, like I talked about in previous videos. It's interesting to know that down here in the input values, now we're seeing that input parameter we created, and it's telling us that the value is going to be inherited from the package. I've already got this created, but you can go ahead and click on Create. And I wanted to show you that when I do run this from the robot, I'll click on Update first, and then click here to run. Notice the message box shows us robot's default value when I run as an attended robot using the task tray. If I had not provided that default value when I created that input argument, this message box window would actually be blank. There's no way to supply a value for that input parameter when you run a robot from the task tray. The only place we can change that input parameter's value is here at the process level, or at the job level, or at the schedule level. So when I go to the Processes tab and hover over this row, I can click on this View Process icon and switch over to the Parameters tab and hover over my desired argument, and notice it says Inherited from Package. That means it's using the default value. If I click on this Edit pencil and type in Job Level Value and click on Save and then Update, now when I run it from the robot task tray, I still see the robot's default value. So like I said, when you're running from an attended robot perspective, you can't change that input parameter's value, and it's not impacted by what you type in Orchestrator. Only when we go to the Jobs tab and click on the play button to run this job, we select the process, select the target robot, and now when I click on Start, you see that we see the job level value instead of that default robot level value. If I want to change the value, I can, again, click to start a job, select my desired process that contains the input parameter, select my target, then go to the Parameters tab and click on the pencil for any one of these input parameters and type in something else. So now when I click on Save, we see that that input parameter has a new value. So when I click to start the job, now when it runs, we see that that new value is reflected in the robot's execution. The same phenomenon can occur on the Schedules tab. When you click on the plus button to create a new schedule, you type in a name for this particular schedule, select your desired process, set up the schedule that you want, and then jump up here to the Parameters tab. And if I click here in Edit, I can type in schedule value, click on Save, and create that schedule. So hopefully you're seeing here that we have another way to essentially create configuration values at the robot level if we don't want to use assets for that purpose. One nice thing about using input parameters is that when you deploy a robot into your dev environment and then into stage and into production, if you're using assets, you've got to make sure that you create the correct assets with the right names and supply values in each of the environments. If you instead use input parameters at the robot level like this, when you publish the robot, those values are going to go with the package into each environment where you publish or upload that package. Of course, you still have to supply the values either at the job level or the schedule level, but you might find it's a little more convenient to not have to keep track of robot level assets using the Assets tab. The 2018.4 version of the UiPath platform has introduced kind of a cool new feature for attended robot users. It's the ability for the robot user to be able to pause the robot. To demonstrate this, I've opened up the Do Repetitive Work project we created in the basic UiPath Skills section. It's the one where I demonstrated the for each loop. All it does is create a log item for each item in the list that it processes. I'm going to modify this and publish it to Orchestrator to demonstrate this pause feature. So I'll go into Snippets and expand the delay snippets and drag in this 1 second here. I'll change this to 4 seconds. And in the Properties pane, I'll change this from 1 second to 4 seconds. So now when it loops, it's going to log the item, then wait 4 seconds, and go back and get the next item. So let's Control S to save this, and click on Design to publish it to Orchestrator. I'll leave that set to the default, and click Publish. I got my success message, so I'll go over to Orchestrator and click on the Processes tab, and create a new process for this package. As a reminder, I click on this plus icon, select my desired process. By default, it chooses the first version since there's only one. And for description, I'll just put in test the robot pause button. confirm that it's assigned to an environment where I know my robot is assigned as well, and click on Create. We can test this by clicking on the task tray down by the clock and opening up the Robot Run panel. Notice I've got a download icon for this do repetitive work process, so I'll click on that. It becomes a play button as expected, and when I click on play, notice that I get this new window up here near the top that tells me it's working, and I've got this pause button and a stop button. So when I go into my robots, I see that the robot is busy, so I can hover over this, click on it, and view logs. So we can see that it's processing item 1 and 2, and when I click refresh, you'll see the items slowly appear because they are on a delay. And at some point, we will see item number 10 and a robot completion message. There we go, we got item 10 and execution ended. So let's click on the task tray and click on the robot icon and run that one more time. Now that it's running, I'm going to click on the pause button and notice that the robot user can now clearly see that this robot is running compared to these other ones down here that are available. And we've got this resume play button. When I go back into Orchestrator and hit refresh, you can see that it processed item 1, and now we've got this automatic log statement that says that the execution is paused. So if I go back to the task tray and click on resume, and we refresh here, we see that some work is being done. And if I pause again, of course, and refresh in Orchestrator, we'll see that the robot is being paused again. So I'm sure you could see where this could be valuable for attended robot users. If they're in the middle of the robot execution and they see that maybe a particular system dependency is down, they can pause the robot and contact the IT team to have them resolve whatever issue brought that system down. And then once the system is back online and they log in, they can resume the robot execution. Of course, if I bring the robot back up and click on this stop button, it asks me to confirm, and when I click yes and refresh over here in Orchestrator, we eventually see that the execution ended and the robot did not continue beyond item 5. So that's a cool new feature only in 2018.4 and above. I hope you enjoy it.